Hi everyone, this is a short screencast for CIMA E2 covering BPP Mixed Bank 5. And in this particular screencast, I'm just going to take you through these 10 questions and hopefully give you a fix on the type of things that are going to be examined, the type of things that we need to be aware of, and maybe one or two tricks as well. So 15.1 really asked here for, do we understand the term strategic alliance? What's its definition? Well, essentially, strategic alliance is really the sharing of resources by two or more companies. So let's try and remember that. We're talking about two or more companies really coming together and sharing something. And what we're required to do here, this is one of those questions where we have to pick out quite a few. I think these are more difficult, although this one is not overly difficult technically. It makes it more difficult when we don't know the number we have to pick out. So we have to think about this one, and I've highlighted what the answers are, A, C, and E and F. Let's be clear on what these mean. Franchising. Really what we're talking about there is, a franchisor and a franchisee, where let's say a product is being produced, but the franchisor retains control of the brand or indeed the marketing. Okay, so certainly two companies, they are in effect, whether you like it or not, you like the terminology, they are sharing resources. In effect, they're sharing the brand and they're sharing the marketing, as it were. So that's why I've sort of ticked this first one, franchising. C, a joint venture. Really, we're talking about two companies at least coming together and setting up some sort of new entity, new organization, but they do retain their own independence. Yeah, they do retain their own independence. So again, it does tie in with that definition of shared resources in two or more companies. Consortium, maybe a tricky one for some people. Let's just try and remember the definition. Normally a sort of a short-term type thing, and probably sort of relevant to a project of some kind, and then the consortium would be sort of disbanded in some way. So again, that does tie in. It could be several, it could be more than two entities coming together, but certainly short-term and project work would be relevant. Okay, licensing, we're really making something, making, product, let's say, for a fee. So again, there are two companies. One is receiving the fee, one's paying it, and in effect they're sharing resources, as it were. So, one or two sort of question marks from students in classes about, how these fall under that banner of strategic alliance. So let's just try and remember franchising, joint ventures, consortium, and licensing. In terms of acquisitions and mergers, well, really acquisitions, that's simply one company buying another. They're not sharing resources. It's really sort of two become one. And in terms of mergers, sort of similar. We're saying that two companies are coming together, but there's only one company left. In effect, we've got two companies merging into one, and that's why they wouldn't fall under that banner. It's not a sort of an alliance going forward. Okay, so that's 15.1. Let's move on to 15.2. And what we have here is one of our sort of classic environmental scanning tools. So we have PEST. They just sort of lengthen it. Now, we should remember with PEST that obviously it includes political, economic, social, and technological. So that would have given us a hint for this first one here, technological. We should have included that. That's item D. And where else do we go from there? Well, L, and G even. Really what they're doing there is they're saying that this pest analysis, this scanning of the environment, needs to take place at really three different levels, local, national, and global. So that's where we get B, national, and E, global, giving us our three. Obviously the L, the local wasn't included, but just to remember for your future studies, the lengthening of pest and the inclusion of local, national, and indeed global. Okay. This next question concerns what's sometimes referred to as, one of the worst business models in the world, the worst business models ever. No need to mention that in your case studies, by the way. We want to keep things professional, and I'll come back to perhaps why that is in a moment. But in essence, what we should remember from BCG in our studies is that really we've got a grid, and on that grid we're trying to map or a company may try to map its products. It could have 4, it might have 44. And really, what we're trying to use the grid to do is to establish what we should do with our products. Okay, and specifically what they do is refer to two types of products on the grid: cash cows and dogs. And really, they're trying to get a fix on whether or not you know, given the axes of the model, whether or not these products have a sort of a low growth market or in a low growth market, or they have a high or low market share. And those are really the sort of the parameters for the matrix. So cash cows certainly have a high share of the market. You know, they've been doing really well, but the market is maturing. In other words, it's or has matured indeed. There's no real growth in the market, or the growth is low. So really, cash cows have, you know, a high share of market and low growth. Now, dogs are not so good at all. It's a low share and a low growth in the market. So really, the common one there is the low market growth D, and that would be the answer. Do remember, of course, that with BCG is the purpose of using it is to really sort of get information, or perhaps thoughts on what you should do with your products. So, you know, for example, with dogs, we have a product that's low share, low market share, and indeed low growth. And what the matrix would advise is to really get rid of them, you know, to get rid of dogs. Now, what about cash cows? Well, you know, the clue's in the title there. Cash cow is a cash generator, albeit for the fact that there's low growth there, it's a high market share. So that means that a cash cow is generating cash. What would you do with it? Well, you'd fund the other two types of product: question marks and indeed stars. And you would hope that in time that the stars, which have a low market share and high growth, will become cash cows. Okay, so you know, what we need to do with the BCG is really to say, you know, do we know what the axes are? So basically, market share relative to the biggest provider in the market, and indeed market growth. Yeah, so those are the two axes, and let's just be familiar with what we would do with each product. So cash cows, we would do what they call harvest. So there was no further investment, but we just really make as much money as we can and fund our question marks and our stars. With dogs, probably no sense in carrying on with them. They are low share, low market share, and low growth. Probably get rid of them. Okay, and just as a matter of interest, although it's more of a sort of an E3 or sort of higher end point than we require within E2, is you know, that one of the main reasons why BCG is criticized is that just because of the axes, in other words, that it only considers sort of share or market share and the growth in the market, and there are a multitude of other things that may impact upon whether or not we invest in a product or get rid of it, etc. So that's the main issue that people have. Okay. This next one here is this area of sort of management, or you know, leadership styles. Yeah, so they're referring specifically to Likert, and I think you probably remember from your studies that this area of sort of management styles, you know, to a large extent centers around a sort of a continuum of behavior, as it were, a continuum of styles, where we're sort of going from really bad to sort of good, I guess, you know, and there may be 2 or 3 or 4 different styles in between, and most of the theories that you come across fit into that little sort of banner, as it were. Okay, so what I've done here is trying to give you a broad fix on, you know, what these areas mean, and you'll see down below that we have a little bit of prompt in relation to the highlighted items also. So benevolent, authoritative, really not so good, but there is an element of trust there on behalf of the management or the manager, and so it's not the worst. The worst would probably be exploitative, authoritative, really got no sort of interest in posing decisions, and probably demotivated staff. In terms of participative, really, I think that's probably one of the better ones. It's a good approach to have. You're participating, involving employees. And in terms of consultative, yeah, again, same sort of thing, but maybe perhaps not quite as good. Yeah. So really, what we're saying is, you know, how do managers approach this idea of management? What are their views on staff? What's the impact on staff? What does staff think? Okay. So in terms of the definition, this first one here, this particular person is a superficial trust, superficial trust, motivates by reward, may involve others in problem solving, but my answer for that is really sort of benevolent, authoritative. Okay. In terms of this second one, really, we're talking about the imposition of decisions. This is not good at all, probably the worst approach. No communication, no teamwork really, probably a lack of motivation on behalf of the employees given this approach. And I think that's got to be B, or in effect the manager is exploiting the employees, no real regard for them. Also think of McGregor's theory X, theory Y, that sort of ties in, or even Tannenbaum and Schmidt and that tells and sells, consults and joins approach. Okay, so A and B to start off with then. In terms of this fourth one here, we've got a little bit of confidence in subordinates and motivation by reward. There's some amount of cooperation or sharing of ideas. Sounds like quite a good sort of approach to management, and I would suspect that employees are motivated to work for this particular manager. And in that case, I think we're talking about a consultative. This fourth one here is sort of going the whole hog, really. We're saying that the employee or the manager listens to subordinates, really uses their ideas, involves. So again, I would say C, participative, and certainly a very, very good approach. I'll draw your attention to the fact that the answer is actually in reverse here for these last two. It goes CD or ABCD. Just watch out for the error in this answer. It should be DC. Okay, moving on to the next one here. I had this sort of question quite a few times. If you check out your sort of any pack that you have on CIMA E2, including obviously the BPP pack, this tends to recur. This is one example. There's several others. We're talking about Harrison here and cultural types. Okay, so in terms of the various options, giving you just a key word, perhaps in relation to each of them. This person, in other words, a sort of a person culture, very much based around sort of the individuals, so the individuals who are involved, and that may well be associated with something like a barrister's chambers, where probably the staff outside of the barristers are all sort of admin based, and the culture is centered around the in effect the jobs that the individuals do, i.e. The barrister function. Okay. In terms of this next one, B, this is pretty common and pretty common associating this, as you will have seen from the text, with the matrix structure. In other words, a project management matrix structure, where you're sort of tying in projects to various functions at the same time. So you have a great deal of flexibility. You've got sort of a cross-functional approach with expertise from a variety of different departments, let's say IT, sales, accounting, etc., etc. And that's certainly focused on getting the job done. So that task culture is all about flexibility and results. Okay. In terms of the role culture, very much associated with rules and procedures and roles. So very much bureaucratic, probably slow changing. Okay. And then this last one, power culture. Really, what we're saying there is, the whole issue is shaped, as it were, or focused on one individual, probably suited to a founder or an owner, and it very much suited to smaller organizations. And the one that I sort of tend to use in class, although perhaps you would say that it's not so small, is perhaps Ryanair or Michael O'Leary, where the culture is really based on the power of that one individual. Okay, so really what we've got is four main types. I'll give you some buzzwords here. So we just got to really pick up the key points from below and just put them in order. So this first one here, where we're being shaped by one individual, that's very much D. It's got to be a power culture. Okay. The second one, clues in the word there, bureaucratic, must be C. It's got to be a role culture. Rules and procedures and rationality, probably very, very slow changing. Okay. This next one here, you remember that I mentioned sort of matrix and flexibility, very much concerned with results and indeed output and getting the job done, as I've mentioned above, for B. Okay, and then just the last one, we're talking about individuals. I mentioned the example of sort of a barrister's chambers. Really, what we're saying there is that that's very much a person culture based around the individuals, a set of barristers, perhaps. Okay, so DCBA for that. Okay, 15.6. Tricky little question here. One again that you've got to sort of pick from a list all that apply. And in this particular case, in fact, 4 out of the 5 do apply. And it refers to this theorist John Hunt. And I think the only thing that we can do with this type of area is to rote learn it, to be honest with you. I think that trying to make sort of full sense of these particular areas, I think it's tricky. We're talking about negotiation, and we're looking for specific characteristics that John Hunt mentioned. So the only way to deal with this is to rote learn. And as I said below, he has 6 main points. So what does he say? Well, B, C, D, and E are relevant. He's talking about, good or successful negotiators. They certainly consider a wide range of options. Something that the examiner tends to do sometimes is, throw in words that you may not be familiar with, like emolument here. I'll come back to that in a moment. So the example of that, would it be helpful if we, and what we mean by that is emolument. We simply mean sort of words that sort of soften or soothe, as I've mentioned here. So, as you can sense yourself, you're in some sort of negotiating theatre, as it were. We'd be saying that those sorts of phrases are sort of quite helpful, and that's the type of thing that successful negotiators would do. In addition to that, they summarize on behalf of all involved. It'd be difficult to sort of pick that up if we hadn't rote learned this. I guess you could think about, what would a great negotiator do, and perhaps they would summarize on behalf of all involved. This last one here is also included single arguments insistently. That caused 1 or 2 problems in class where students thought that sounds a little bit strong. But we just have to remember that they don't use multiple reasoned arguments, and they will advance single arguments insistently. Now, in relation to Hunt, they, as far as we're concerned, we just need to remember that there are in fact 6 main points. So come back to A above in a moment. Aside from what we see here, B, C, D, and E, they also hold back counter proposals. So they don't proffer counter proposals if they've just heard something that they're not in agreement with. They don't respond immediately. So that would be the 5th one. And really the 6th one is that they avoid confrontation rather than directly confronting the opposition. So they avoid this. Okay, so 1 to 6, just reverse of that, including this one down the bottom. Okay, watch out for that word there, emolument, so soften or indeed soothe. Okay. So moving on to 15.7, social responsibility. I would expect to see some sort of question on this popular little topic in the past exam diet. What does responsibility mean? What does social responsibility mean? Well, certainly, sort of maximizing the positive impact and minimizing the negative impact on society and or the environment. Okay, so that's essentially what SR is. Quite a few different views. 2 main ones that we'll be aware of, we should be aware of, and I think this question was trying to sort of play with this terminology here. But in terms of the views, well, stakeholder view, let's consider all stakeholders. So that's very much a pro-stakeholder, SR or CSR stance, where we're trying to consider everybody. We're trying to consider the environment, the local community, staff, customers, etc., etc. So we want to perhaps spend money on being responsible, being a good corporate citizen. The other side of it is really, I guess, what you call the shareholder view, and really that's supported by Friedman's old classic quote of the business of business is business. We're really saying there that what we should be doing is focusing on what a shareholder wants. And what does a shareholder want? Well, profit maximization, growth in net assets, basically money, a return. Yeah. And I think the trickiness in this question is that they use this phrase, the traditional approach. And it's not something that I would necessarily do in class to talk about a traditional approach. But they're using it here, so let's just do what the examiner does. And really that traditional approach, yeah, is the old, if you will, the shareholder approach. So that's the traditional approach. In other words, that SO doesn't really matter, yeah, and that we should, as I've said, the one that I've chosen is A, that organizations should exist for the benefit of their shareholders, and everything else is irrelevant. Also, just remember your 3 Ps here, people, planet, profit. That would be, very much sort of pro CSR. It's important that we have regard for people, for the planet, and indeed for profit. So think about all 3 rather than just one. Okay. Also draw your attention to perhaps, the theorist Carolyn Buchholz, and they talk about, levels of corporate citizenship, where they're going from sort of your standard economic through to sort of legal, i.e. compliance with laws, up to sort of ethical, and then the sort of top end philanthropic. So think about those 4 ones, and how good of a corporate citizen does a company want to be. Okay. Next one here, 15.8. Tricky little question, I think. Again, we need specific knowledge of exactly what they mean by these areas here, sort of A to B. I mean, essentially what they're saying here is that in relation to this area of change, and remember that change has just been introduced to your syllabus, change management, and it's been linked into project management. Really what they're saying here is that we would have confusion or demotivation within staff, for staff, where there's some sort of divergence between the adjustments that are being made and what the staff perceive to be the intent of the change program. So there's some sort of confusion, and what they're asking you to do is really pick out which sort of outcome is being described. And I think that's tricky with a couple of these. So let's just go down them. Ivory tower change, maybe that's not so difficult. People living in an ivory tower, you'll be familiar with that phrase. Really what we're saying is that change is sort of driven by people who are out of touch, driven from sort of board level downwards. Okay. This next one, lack of attention to symbols. And really what we're saying there is that the change isn't relevant. The sort of people involved in pushing forward the change are not paying regard to day-to-day reality, i.e. symbols, yeah, and in effect they're given the wrong message, yeah. And in terms of this C part, Part C, behavioural compliance, we're saying, the issue there is that staff are complying in some way, but they're not really sort of in tune with it. They're not sort of, they don't really have a buy-in. They're just sort of going ahead because they have to, yeah. And really what we had to do, and as I say, I think it's difficult to get this right. What we had to say here was that really D was relevant, i.e. uncontrolled efforts. You might think, well, what does that mean? Well, essentially what it means is that there's no sort of fit and there's no sort of tie-in from staff in relation to the changes above. In other words, that the practical adjustments that are taking place are confusing staff because they don't seem to be in line with the overall intent of the change. So there doesn't seem to be a tie-in between the two. That should obviously say confusion from staff. Apologies for that. Okay, so the answer in this case is D. In terms of my sort of advice on how to deal with something like this, I think we've got to be able to define these areas. Perhaps behavioral compliance is sort of easy to define, that people are doing it but not because they buy into it. Ivory tower, it's coming from above. Perhaps B and D are a little bit more difficult. So if you could just learn those notes that I've included there, that may help you. Okay. This next one, not overly difficult. We're talking about project management and indeed boundaries. And what we should be aware of is that obviously boundaries are important, and that does link in with that word scope. In other words, the scope of the project. What is included and indeed what isn't. And we've got to watch out for obviously something called scope creep, where the boundaries of the project are extending outside our control. and that's going to lead to problems going forward in the project in terms of delivery on time, within budget, etc., etc. Okay, so C is the answer there. Next one that we have is, again, a reference to this matrix structure. They do like this one. Remember, the matrix structure is very much the preferred structure for project management. It's very flexible. We've got individuals in different departments, their expertise being relied upon at the same time, IT, sales, etc. So in terms of the disadvantage, we should be able to see fairly quickly, and certainly that dual authority, this idea of project team members having to report to their project manager, but also reporting to their own function or their own departmental manager, causes a problem. They're sort of betwixt in between, causes them difficulty. So dual authority creates a problem and indeed confusion. So that is certainly not an advantage of the matrix structure. I would say that it's certainly a disadvantage. Now, all of these three other ones, and let's watch for these, certainly flexibility is key to the matrix. Motivation, people are getting involved with other departments. Maybe they're learning new things from other members of other departments. That maybe is sort of good for their sort of motivation, maybe good for their sort of career advancement as well. And often comms or better comms is associated with the sort of upside of a matrix structure. Whether or not that's the case in practice is another question. So let's just remember flexibility, better motivation, and certainly improved comms. They would be advantages. Dual authority would be seen as a disadvantage. Okay, so hopefully that's been helpful. I'll leave you with that, and good luck with your studies. Cheers.